Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here. I'm really delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we gather for today's expanded virtual brown bag session. I know some of you, but for those of you who I don't, my name is Alex Wiseman, and I have the honor of representing both the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy Program as a professor and the Center for Innovative Research and Change Leadership in Education, which we call CIRCLE, as its director. And I want to just really thank you for joining us for the Expanded Brown Bag series today, featuring Dr. Gerry LeTendre. A little bit about the virtual brown bag series before we start. It's part of CIRCLE's commitment to developing an environment of innovation, research, learning, and collaboration that we hope extends locally all the way to nationally. I'll ask you, if you don't mind, to please check out and share our expanded website with your colleagues and friends and students. An easy way to find it is literally to Google TTU expanded, and our website should be the first item in the results list, or at least at the top. And we genuinely invite you to register for as many of our upcoming virtual brown bags as you can. We really want to see you there. We've got a great lineup of speakers for the spring, as well as one more this fall. I'm really proud to share with you that we've gathered what I think is a remarkable ensemble of researchers, educators, and experts, our guest today being one of those, as expanded speakers, that come from as close as right here at Texas Tech University and from highly esteemed institutions across the country, like Penn State University. Our speakers' dedication to the pursuit of knowledge in the realms of educational practice, leadership, and policy is really inspiring for all of us, and we're thrilled that all of the speakers who have agreed to be a part of this are willing to share their insight. So please check out who else is speaking in the coming months. Register to attend all of them. We'll send you reminders, and that way you'll be good to go on the day of the talk. I also wanted to mention it's really important for us that expanded, even though it's in a virtual format, be also about engagement. So as it is appropriate today, we invite all of you to participate actively, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and collaborate with us and with our speaker in the pursuit of knowledge. But we ask that you do so in a particular way. So while Dr. LeTendre is speaking, if you have questions that you want to ask or share, if you just put those in the chat, then they'll be there when it's possible for Dr. LeTendre to address them. Most of those questions will probably be answered, and verbal questions as well can be answered in the Q&A time that will follow the presentation. And I think if we follow that format, we'll have a great exchange of ideas and information. So without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Gerald K. LeTendre as our expanded speaker today. Dr. LeTendre is the Harry Lawrence Batschelet II Chair of Educational Administration for the College of Education at Penn State and co-editor of the American Journal of Education. He received his BA magna cum laude in sociology from Harvard University and was awarded a Rockefeller Fellowship for fieldwork among Tibetan refugees. He completed his graduate work at Stanford University, receiving his master's in sociology and Ph.D. in education. Dr. LeTendre has been the recipient of a Japan Foundation Fellowship, Johann Jacobs Young Scholar Award, and a Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. He was a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Bremen in Germany and a Fulbright Research Scholar at Sophia University in Tokyo. Dr. LeTendre has published on a broad range of topics in comparative and international education, including books titled Learning to be Adolescent, Improving Teacher Quality, Promoting and Sustaining a Quality Teacher Workforce, and also the International Handbook of Teacher Quality and Policy. His current research focuses on how information and communication technology, specifically social robots, is changing teacher work roles and professional development worldwide. And I will just add that I have a personal affinity for Dr. LeTendre. He has been a friend, a colleague, and a mentor for more than 20 years for me. And it's really a joy to have you joining us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerry LeTendre as he presents his research talk titled Evolving Conceptions of Teacher Leadership in World Culture.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Does the sound coming through fine for everyone? Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. And I just want to say thank you, Alex, and also just note how impressed I've been with the work you've been doing there. I'm constantly, it seems, getting announcements about talks or new programs that are opening there. This center that you've got going is just amazing. It's really an honor to be invited to participate in it, but I'm very impressed by the range of work that you're doing. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And hopefully that's all good for folks. I can see you on my sidebar. So yeah, I'm going to talk about conceptions of teacher leadership in world culture today. And let me just preface that a little bit by kind of setting the stage. Teacher leadership is a particular topic that's come in and out of fashion in the United States, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But what I'm really trying to get at is how a specific construct like teacher leadership evolves and then is transmitted, diffused, and moves around in the global world. And by global, I do mean global, although I will talk about how, certain areas and certain societies are far more connected and, of course, have more access to and more visibility in this world culture. What I'm going to argue today is the base concept of leadership as a construct has played a central role in a lot of the globally diffusing educational reforms of the last few decades. Both the accountability and the decentralization movements assume that there will be a more active and informed leadership in schools. And then, of course, the standard neoliberal argument, this is going to result in higher test scores, blah, 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 better school performance. It all comes back to competition. But this vision of leadership is rooted in a cultural logic of Western individualism and rationalized educational environments that are indeed organized around cultural logics of human capital development. And so I want to look at that and kind of look at teacher leadership more as a cultural product that's then being repackaged and exported around the world. So that's what's going to be the talk today. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about where it came from, how it's been developed in the US, how it's been used and misused in the US, and then trace it over its appearance in some of the global dialogues and how it's being used in some of the global foundations. In the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of a floating signifier, which those of you who've ever studied semiotics will probably be familiar with, and kind of try to draw out some ideas about how concepts like this function and can be misused, but may also be opening up spaces for more innovation. Okay, so when we say teacher leadership is a cultural product, by that I mean it's really evolved within a particular national culture, and that is the US. And the reason that it's evolved is that the historical status of teachers in the US has rarely risen to the level of a true profession. In fact, most sociologists wouldn't consider teachers a profession. They consider them a mass profession, like police officers and nurses. And this is a significant difference. Professions have control over the creation of their own knowledge and their own certification standards. To give an example, if there was a shortage of doctors, we wouldn't be going to state departments of health and asking what kind of policy we need for new doctors. AMA would jump right in, and has. But with teachers, what happens is when we have a teacher shortage, well, it's the Texas Department of Education or some other, and the teachers themselves are really not counted and have a difficult time having their voice heard as a kind of professional organization. This kind of fact, this kind of relegation in schools of a two-tiered system of professional administration and workers, teachers, goes back a long way. And people realize that this, has problems for school reformation and innovation. So as early as the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a push within the US to create more formal career roles like master teacher that would provide more of a professional ladder and also more authority and autonomy at the school. And subsequent reform waves in the US have focused on developing individual skills and capacities among teachers, so teacher leadership as professional development. And of course, as I mentioned, most recently, teacher leader policies have been used as a way to mitigate teacher shortages and improve retention. So this experimentation has gone on in the US for quite some time. Smiley in 1995 talked about how leadership was becoming a sort of critical tool in trying to professionalize teachers. And in addition to the master teacher movement, there were a lot of other experimentation with creating distinct roles in the teacher career path. Smiley notes that these included career ladders, lead teacher, master teacher, mentor teacher, and push for participative decision-making. And he also notes that by the late 1980s, nearly every state had adopted or was studying some variation of these programs. So this is something that's had wide traction in the US. It's been played with a lot, and it's also created a lot of different programs. There hasn't been a lot of unity. And if you look at the reviews, academic reviews of teacher leadership that have been done, you'll see that there's really not a lot of consistency in how people are thinking about what teacher leadership is or how it should be defined. Nonetheless, that hasn't stopped people from promoting standards. So different versions of teacher leadership standards have been promulgated. And here's one that the NEA, which is one of the major teacher unions in the US, has promoted. I just saw in the news today, I didn't know this, that the NEA is actually chartered as a federal agency, and that a group of senators has formed together to propose a law that would do away with that. So we live in a highly politicized environment, and it won't surprise me if teacher leadership gets drawn into that. And I will talk a little bit more about that. But let's first focus on these model standards. So what does a teacher leader do? There is a group of people, folks within the sort of teacher leadership studies that really see teacher leaders as staying in their classrooms, but taking a broader role in extra classroom decision-making. There are others who see teacher leadership as a movement into higher roles. But many of these core facets are agreed upon and have a link with this idea of professionalization. So teacher leaders are going to try and foster more collaborative culture. They should be active in accessing and using research, if not in creating their own. They should promote professional learning. In other words, they, instead of just doing their own professional learning themselves, should be promoting it and helping others, particularly newer teachers, get into it. Facilitating improvements in instruction and student learning, promoting the use of assessments and data for the school, improving outreach and collaboration with families, and advocating for student learning and the profession. So what you really see here is an expansion of the teacher's role beyond instruction in the classroom to encompass many of the aspects that sociologists would traditionally associate with a profession. Particularly this self-study and continual improvement, but also the outreach and collaboration. Now, what's not mentioned here is policy advocacy, but that comes when we look at another set of standards that are also promoted by the NEA, but were developed along with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and the Center for Teacher Quality. And here you can see, particularly down in this part here, that policy leadership has now been added to it. And so this is a little bit different way of thinking about teacher leadership. Diversity, equity, and inclusion or cultural competence has been added. They originally was just these 1, 2, 3 sort of interlapping circles. This has been added, I think, since the early 2000s. There's an idea that there should be overarching competencies which all teachers need to have before they become leaders, including personal effectiveness, communication. But then teachers need skills in exploring and challenging inequality. They need improved instructional leadership. In other words, going beyond just being a good teacher, but helping other teachers improve. They need to be active in their own associations and organizing their schools or their professional associations. And they need to have policy skills. In other words, they need to be able to advocate for best practices, advocate for their schools, and advocate for their teachers. This again pushes teachers then into a much more professional role. Some of the teacher leadership fellowships that are out there, particularly those organized by the AFT, the American Federation for Teachers, really push on this advocacy role. They want teachers to really be out there and, challenging policy. Again, in a climate where you've got senators coming together to produce, I believe, what is called the Student Act that would, essentially reorganize NEA. It's critical that the teachers are out there and having their voice and their interests represented in what has become a highly contentious political climate. So Wenner and Campbell, as I said, produced one of the best reviews of teacher leadership. And although they argue that there has been a lack of coalescence around a clear vision for teacher leadership, they do note that almost all of these teacher leadership movements, ideas, activities, or professional promotions, push or try to create a kind of professional career trajectory. They get into talking about some of the factors that can facilitate teacher leadership, this external training and support, the climate and structure, allowing teachers to lead more in their work, as well as clear-cut job responsibilities and recognition for meeting those. And I think this is in some way a response to how teacher leadership has been enacted, which is to say, principals dump more work on teachers. And indeed, when I talk with many of the teachers in our program, for some of them, teacher leadership is a bad word. It means more work without any more pay or any more real responsibility. And this begins to hint at my accusation that teacher leadership is a floating signifier. That we see teacher leadership being used sometimes in local schools as a way to simply normalize or rationalize the delegation of tasks principals don't otherwise want to do onto teachers, rather than seeing it as a true kind of professional empowerment and indeed co-responsibility for activities that go on in the school and advocacy for the school and the students in the broader community and policy arena. So let me just take a little bit of a digression here and kind of exemplify for you how this then gets moved into policy. So we've had a lot of academics writing about teacher leadership. We've had teacher advocates writing about it. We've had NEA, AFT. Well, the states have decided that they're going to use this. And as you can see here, about 30 states in the US have advanced licenses for teachers. So they already had encoded some of this idea that teaching needs to have a more structured career ladder. 22 states have specifically adopted a teacher leader license. In other words, after you get your original or your base licensure or certification as a teacher, you can go on and get a teacher leader license or certificate, or here in the state of Pennsylvania, we call them endorsements. Again, remember, it's the US. It's more like the European Union than a country. We've got 50 states that largely set their own educational policy and are only constrained by the federal government when it comes to federal laws and federal funding. So 22 states have adopted teacher leadership license. And what this license does is allow teachers to advance beyond a standard professional license. I'm reading here from some of the material created by the Educational Commission for the state. Multi-year licenses teachers can earn by completing a series of requirements above and beyond those associations. And typically they're often connected to subject and grade specialty. But then we have, in addition or distinct from these licenses, the adoption by state boards of education of teacher leadership standards. So teacher leader standards establish the competencies and skills unique to a teacher leader. 17 states have adopted teacher leader standards. Of these, 9 states have adopted their own standards. 6 states have adopted the teacher leader model standards developed by the Teacher Leadership Exploratory Consortium, and 2 states have adopted the teacher leader model standards. So what we've going on here already is a lot of slippage and some odd inconsistencies. Some individual states, have licensing and endorsement requirements that contain standards, but some do not. And this creates what I call a real issue with policy coherence. So here you have a fair number of states, and at least one huge state, Texas, where you've got a teacher leader license, but you have no adoption of standards. That on the surface to me is problematic. Now, people might argue, well, within the licensure language within the state law, you may have explication of these. But I do find it highly odd that a state would create a license but not formally adopt a set of standards. So don't mind the fact that states can agree on which standards to adopt. They go ahead and they create licenses without adopting any standards. And what this does then is it really breaks up or creates real barriers then for a systematic movement of teaching as a profession to establish what are the clear roles, duties, expectations, and forms of authority and autonomy which teachers would need if they're going to move into these leadership roles. Basically, again, we've got 50 states, 50 standards. They can't agree, and some states can't even provide a clear and consistent licensure that is aligned with already recognized teacher leadership standards. Now, you might ask, well, what could be driving this? Well, in another paper, one thing that we're arguing drives this is that teacher leadership was early on seen as a way to address teacher shortage issues. And teacher leadership in both the US and the global discourse often comes up in the context of teacher shortages. So states may have adopted these teacher licenses as a kind of stopgap measure or proactive, preemptive measure to deal with teacher shortages without really thinking about what needs to be done in terms of setting standards and creating a kind of baseline for understanding what teacher leadership actually is. So again, teacher leadership becomes a kind of nebulous concept, a kind of idea that's out there that at least state departments of education latch onto and can use to address a problem of the moment. So that's the US scenario and largely where we're at today. Now let me shift gears and talk about this more global discourse on teacher leadership. And at the end, I'm going to cycle back and use the example of Japan to kind of provide a more dramatic comparison with a radically different country with radically different ideas about leadership. But first of all, the most important thing to note is that teacher leadership wasn't really on the radar of international organizations up until about 2000. Now, there were certainly people in the US and perhaps other countries talking about it. But remember that in many countries, and it's not just countries like Japan, within England, you had the head teacher idea. Teacher leadership was not problematic. There was a tradition of teachers moving into headships over school. There were cultural formulations in different countries of what it meant to advance. And In some countries like Finland and Singapore, the teaching profession itself was actually very close to, if not a full-blown profession. It was not at the level of the mass profession that it was in the US. So while all this stuff is going on in the US, within the US cultural context, the world is just going on fine without the need to think about teacher leadership until about, like I say, the early 2000s. So as I show here, the ILO UNESCO CERT recommendations, which are often talked about as a foundational point when these international groups come together to talk about teachers, doesn't mention leadership. In 2005, you get a report that is largely reflecting or summarizing the academic teacher leadership material, arguing that every teacher can be a leader. And then bam, UNESCO, OECD really jumps in 2005, and they mention leadership 68 times. So you begin to see already that leadership doesn't come up in the international or global arena until much later than the US, but it also comes up differentially in different places. UNESCO is rather slow to jump on this, as was Education International, the Global Teachers Union, but OECD placed exceptional emphasis on leadership. It began talking about what it calls school leadership, and it argued that such leadership is central to any substantive and long-lasting reforms. Okay. Now, the document fails to define precisely who constitutes the leadership of schools, but notes that, quote, people have been teaching in school for some time. Yeah. And teachers in some countries are expected to participate in and contribute to school leadership. So this kind of opens the door then for thinking about a more administrative or reform-oriented role for teacher leadership. In Teachers Matter, the OECD also calls for reforms that would, they say, benefit the teaching career by creating greater diversification as well as helping meet school needs. This has now evolved within the EU to a discussion of middle school leaders. So there's a recognition that there are administrative or head school leaders, that there are teachers, and then that there are this group in the middle, which in the US parlance would probably be called teacher leaders, but within the various EU country constituent organizations may occupy other, more specific roles. And the OECD also goes on to cite, different countries, saying that England, Australia, and Sweden all are models of nations with systemic paths to developing administrative capacity in school leadership. So here again, we see teacher leadership not being defined as the way many folks in the US would define it, which would be a non-administrative role, but clearly allied with administration. In a subsequent text, Andreas Schlechter, who's been prominent in the OECD, talked about effective school autonomy depends on effective leaders, including system leaders, principals, teacher leaders, senior teachers, and head teachers, as well as strong support systems. Why does he differentiate? We don't know, because there is no clear definition or clear policy about what would differentiate a head teacher from a senior teacher from a teacher leader. There's only this emphasis on leadership as a kind of functional administrative role that is critical to making schools better. Here again, more slippage in the language, lack of precision, and active use of the term without any real, I think, movement forward on what the term needs to be. The rationales that you hear in these documents are often something like this. Quote, it is usually up to school leaders to implement curricula and instruction effectively. An important role for school leaders is that of collaboration with other schools or communities around them. So what's being set up here is that the OECD is a global actor, and who many have criticized as having a kind of symbolic control over what counts as good teaching or quality education. Susan Robertson and Tori Sorensen have raised this critique. But the OECD is also then kind of reworking and creating a new cultural logic about how schools should operate and how leadership should operate in terms of national policy strategy for bettering schools and creating better environments for kids. So what happens then over the 2000s is this whole idea of schools as engines of improvement and policy as an engine to improve schools really shifts from a focus on a broader schools and curriculum, which was particularly a point of contention in the 90s, to teachers. And I'm calling this a global convergence on teachers, perhaps not in a good way, because we see a shift in the language from the earlier material of Teachers Matter, which in some ways can be seen as a kind of call to take teachers seriously. Again, remember that when this stuff was coming out, the largest arguments in the sort of global dialogue in the wake of TIMSS and PISA was that curriculum was a problem. There was the famous saying that the US curriculum is an inch wide and a mile wide and an inch deep. So the initial reaction and the initial focus, really seemed positive. Teachers matter. Teachers are at the heart of the school. We should really pay more attention to teachers. And of course, this worry pops up about the more optimistic of these would be jeopardized if a serious teacher shortage occurs. So already we're starting to see this linkage and this worry that, we're not going to have enough teachers, enough quality teachers, and we really have to pay attention to that. That shifts then over time to what I'm saying is teachers as target populations. So from a focus and a realization that teachers matter to now, okay, what do we do about them, right? What do we do about them? What do policymakers, what do national governments, what do transnational research groups do about teachers? Structuring teachers as target populations does not promote teacher professionalization. Rarely in this literature do you hear much teacher voice, and while you might see some kind of symbolic gesture saying, well, teachers should be involved in policy processes more, these reports tend to be generated and continue to go out without any real consultation of the teachers. Case in point, the GEM report on leadership, which was commissioned by UNESCO and was just closed this past fall, used a definition of leadership as a process of social influence, which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of the goal. It says the role of the person or team leading a school, including school administrator, director, principal, and head teacher. So you're now seeing even places like UNESCO taking on this idea that the professionalization or the importance of teachers is being shifted from one of purely focusing on teachers as a profession and their own professional autonomy to being effective leaders of these global reforms and these more effective ways of organizing school, which are being promoted by these transnational global policy organizations. So Lurch and Bromley just last year wrote, this focus on leadership is consistent with the expanding and evolving global culture of educational policy and reform that's heavily infused with neoliberal conceptions of human capital development, and that take as axiomatic the assumption that schools function to provide individuals with operations to improve their skills and capacities, allowing individuals further opportunities within society. Over and beyond that, I'd say what these reports and what this global discourse is evolving to is an understanding of leadership which doesn't take into account how teachers themselves in their varied national cultures and their communities may see themselves as leaders and may understand this core construct of leadership. What does it mean to lead your class? Does it have moral dimensions? Does it have ethical dimensions? Does it have dimensions outside the class? So what's really happening is this term, this construct teacher leadership, has now become a kind of global policy mechanism. There's now a full-fledged transnational studies going on, the ISTL, International Study of Teacher Leadership, which you can find on this website, the GEM report, as I've said, and multiple national reforms that are going on that try to promote this. And again, this is global. UNESCO in particular has pointed out this concern with massive teacher shortages, which they say are quietly looming over countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the Arab states, and South Asia. I don't think it's quiet. There have been multiple global meetings about this. I think it's quite loud. But here again, the teacher leadership is being formulated as a policy response to these shortages, not as something to promote teachers. We are seeing a bit of a shift in language to this collaboration and collective leadership language. So I think that there's a growing awareness that teachers have to be engaged as on a more equal footing. But it's interesting to me how this collective leadership still gets contextualized within this need to respond to other crises or issues of the moment. And here just is one final example, or one other example. This comes from the Johann Jacobs Foundation. They've had this program going on to achieve these goals by 2030. They're operating in a number of countries. And here, look at how they're using the language. So they're not using the term teacher leadership, but they're focusing on teacher agency, which is, they say, recognize and amplifying teachers as leaders, innovators, and active agents in education reform. Again, some of this sounds quite good. It sounds like a very more active and dynamic role and a recognition of that role. The question will be, to what extent are these agencies and are these national governments actually creating reforms that allow teachers to become these active agents, to become these innovators, and indeed to function as true leaders in their schools? There's a strong tie with professionalism, which I want to talk about just before we leave, because that ties back to the older US idea. OECD, of course, has created the Center for Educational Research and Innovation. As it says there, it performs research work to achieve lifelong learning, goes beyond formal education systems. Look at how they're now thinking about teaching. So they've come up with this program of new professionalism in the future of teaching, where they argue that teaching is a knowledge profession that requires practitioners to continually update their knowledge based on new scientific findings. And yet they recognize in their own report that teachers rarely have the autonomy or the pay consistent with professional status, and therefore are unlikely to be able to achieve this. So there continues to be this kind of odd dialogue where, teacher leadership and the importance of teachers is recognized, and, we should be doing all these things to help teachers do this. But in actuality, none of these things are happening for teachers. And these global promotions of reform or school improvement tend to continue to crank on and to use this term in ways that suit the policy issues of the moment. Now, I apologize for this slide. I'm not good at PowerPoint, so it's come out a little weird, but I want to go back now and reflect on what this means. So I taught in Japan, just as Alex did. I first taught there in 1987. I've written a lot about teacher work roles in Japan. And long before there was any hue and cry in the global community about teacher leadership, Japan had organized pre-war and reorganized post-war a system of distinct roles for teachers, which all have what we would call a leadership component. But they don't use the word leadership in Japan. They typically use words like shido, guidance. And in fact, they may never use a term like that at all, but they clearly indicate very different responsibilities, autonomies, and privileges for teachers. So you've got a young teacher in their first 1 to 3 years, and basically the older teacher's like, just learn how to manage a class. Get good at teaching your subject. After that, we're going to make you a homeroom teacher, a tannin sensei. If you say that to any Japanese person, they know exactly what it means. They know exactly what the duties are, what's associated with it, and the kind of status and autonomy that goes with it. You don't have to mention leadership. You don't have to even mention student guidance. It's there in the culture. As are all the rest of these terms, a grade chair, subject chair, head of guidance, head of curriculum, all the way up to principal, where it's understood that you're never going to be a principal in Japan unless you've taught for 15 or 20 years. And radically different from the United States, where many principals teach for 2 to 5 years and then move into administrative track. Now, what's happening is you have this whole national system of education that's organized around these organization and cultural principles, which encode ideas of leadership and ideas of autonomy, where teachers developed on their own something called lesson study, which has now taken on its own global life, but was originally a teacher self-initiated professional development. They are all now subsumed under teacher leadership. So the teacher leadership construct that originates in America, becomes globalized, is now used in these international policy dialogues and in these international reports to contextualize what's going on in Japan. So it creates these real problems for trying to understand how leadership, or one might even say authentic leadership, occurs in different countries when one is dealing with these transnational reform discourses and emphases on making schools more efficient. So in a recent paper with Joe Helgeton and Hansel Wu, we've tried to unpack some of this, and we've tried to talk about how do we deal with these different cultural logics and these diffusion of educational reforms in a culturally dynamic model. And what we're arguing is that nations themselves and their policy formations are part of the global or world cultural dynamic. It's where culture's being made. It doesn't just get made at the OECD or UNESCO or INGOs. This is an interrelated web where knowledge and ideas flow. And what's happening is that a discourse around a problem like teacher shortage comes up. It's an issue. And then there's continuous reference within the discourse to that issue. There's what Joe Helgeton calls re-truthification. In other words, what we thought was true of teacher shortages now becomes something new, right? We used to think teacher shortages in the US were due to an underproduction of teachers until Rich Ingersoll came along and said, no, it's attrition, okay? Now we re-truthify and we talk about attrition, which means, oh, we got to talk about teacher leaders because teachers are leaving, and that's the reason we have shortages. And so this creates the new cultural logics that are taken for granted as assumptions of what works. Now, I'm not saying that these cultural logics are purely myths. To use Meyer's term, I think they're rationalized myths. They have bases in empirical evidence and they may align with empirically established facts, but they are separate from and distinct from scientific evidence in the policy discourse to have a life of its own. And here's where I'm arguing that teacher leadership pops up and plays a very useful role as a floating signifier. So what's a floating signifier? Well, it's something that can be applied across multiple contexts. And here you can apply it across multiple national contexts. Oh, we've got teacher leadership in Japan. And we think we know what that means. But if you haven't understood what the responsibilities of a tannin sensei, a homeroom teacher, are, and have some vague understanding of Japanese notions about guidance, shido, you really don't know. We have no idea what leadership means in Japan. But the floating signifier is a very comfortable place to say, oh, yes, we can talk about that. Floating signifier also allows representation from multiple professional aspects. We can talk about teacher leadership in terms of teachers' profession, teachers' roles in the school, how they should be instructional leaders, policy leaders, etc. It's readily integrated into multiple reform agendas. So whether you want to change how co-leadership works in the schools, or you want to improve instructional design, teacher leadership's a useful term. And what I'm going to argue, I think, is most interesting is that I believe it occupies an interstitial space between political or ideological camps. Now, by interstitial, I'm using Bridwell Maxwell's idea that we in our organizations and our institutions get caught in our own cultural logics. We don't see the difference between our cultural logics and actual data that's out there. And we step into any organization, whether it be a bank or a school, and we assume that the way things run is a logical way to do things. Okay. And it isn't until someone comes that can provide a kind of ethnographic, oh, wow, this is different, I never thought of it that way, that there's no space to change that. Floating signifiers can create these bridges between ideological camps. Both camps can use them, but when they have to come together to talk about their differences in them, it creates this interstitial space. And Bridwell Maxwell argues that many innovators, many policy innovators, are skilled players in these interstitial places. They are skilled at using the comparison of different cultural logics or cultural rationales to point out the fact that, yes, the way we do things does have some basis or some reference to an empirical reality, and one process may be better than the other, but a lot is culturally determined. It's habits, it's ideas, it's rationales we've picked up over time, and those are ones we can change. And we can change them to make it better for ourselves, for others, and therefore, in this case, I'd say make it better for teachers and better for students. So I think teacher leadership, from this perspective, understanding how it functions in these global policy reforms and in national policy debates, offers us a window onto perhaps thinking about how we can move out of these locked in political conflicts that we have to begin thinking about the assumptions we make about leadership, who it's going to affect, and how we promote leadership among our teachers. I think I've gone over my time, so I'm going to end there and stop my screen sharing, and happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you all very much for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. LeTendre. Really appreciate your insight on that. We do have about 12 minutes left for questions. So please feel free to either turn your microphone on and ask, or you can raise your hand and we'll take turns, or you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, I think Hugo, did you have your hand up?
No, I was just clapping. Thank you for the presentation. But but since you bring me up, when I was a teacher, I worked in East LA, and the students that I worked with were students who got removed from Roosevelt High School and Garfield High School and sent to my charter high school. So you can kind of tell the kind of students I was working with. Right? These were at-risk youth, troubled youth, and I would have to work with probation officers, not just the parents, right? And so the challenge of the mental stress that comes with of working with youth who have troubled homes, right? And it was a charter school where it was self-contained. I was the only teacher, 9th through 12th grade. I taught all subjects. And so there was no master teacher for me to go to. They just threw me in there after I did my undergrad and I was working on my emergency credentials. And so the challenge of how does one see themselves as a leader within an organization that is really loosely coupled, right? We talk about loosely coupling within higher education, but within some of these charter schools or some of these K-12 systems, they can be very disconnected as well. And so for me, my whole thing was like, it was a year-round school that, aside from the coming in early in the morning, leaving late, going home to have dinner, preparing my lessons plan for next day, and then leaving early to drive from Long Beach to East LA at a housing project where the community center took place. It's like I wasn't seeking for any leadership programs. I wasn't looking to become a leader within my school that I work for, because it's so mentally draining that anytime I had free from my work and from working with my students and parents and everybody else, it's like it was so draining. So I guess my question to you is like, you talk about the importance of continuous professional development, but under some of these conditions, it's like the challenge of it's like, well, it's fine and dandy, and I agree that folks should be trying to develop some leadership skills, but for some folks, at the end of the day, at 2 or 3 o'clock, we're just completely drained. So, I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Those are excellent points, Hugo. And when you talked about dealing with probation officers, I recalled some of my mentor teachers in Japan working with the police with a couple of the kids who were really having problems. So what I'd say is you were already a leader. You were an exemplary leader. You're dealing with probation officers, you're working with the community. You simply weren't recognized, nor was any of the unpaid work you were doing recognized as leadership. This is exactly what we, are talking about, that if teachers are going to make a difference, they're going to have to know their community, know their kids, be in touch with these various stakeholders, and be able to act as advocates for them. But how can you do that if you don't get paid and you don't have any extra time? And that's why I say, as a floating signifier, this teacher leadership becomes a very useful tool. It's a great way to say to teachers, well, do all this extra work. You should have all these extra, facets of your profession that you should take into account. And indeed, some of those may well be very beneficial for students. But as I said, if there's no concomitant, if there's no adjoining commitment to paying teachers more, giving them more time off, or giving them the kind of, I think, emotional counseling support that's often needed when dealing with kids who are in real crisis, then it breaks down. And I think, policymakers don't care about that. And the other danger is that it then prevents us from seeing just how stressful these roles can be, but also how other cultures or other systems may evolve support networks or support for teachers who actually take on these very vital leadership roles. So as I said, many of the teachers I talk with, when you say teacher leadership, it's like a dirty word to them because their experience is very similar to yours. The work they were doing was never recognized as leadership, was never given any compensation, and they were never given any kudos or extra time for the exemplary leadership they displayed. And I think we really need to have to shift that dialogue and rethink what leadership means, particularly when it comes for advocating for kids who no one else will advocate for.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up with all that, I was overworked and underpaid, and I was still working on my emergency credentials because it's like nobody wanted to work with these kids. They would bring in folks who had master's degrees and teaching credentials in South Central LA and East LA. Those were the folks who, once they got their credentials, they left, right? And so someone with me who was working on my emergency credentials, I wanted to stay and work with these kids because I saw myself in them. And so there was a level of caring that I provided that others didn't. So I've been using this theory of caring by Watson, in that sense of I wasn't looking at it from the perspective of how can I move up within the organization? How can I, it was me, how can I care for these kids that others are not caring for? Like other teachers may have dismissed them, administrators may have dismissed them, court systems and law enforcement have dismissed them, but they came to me because they were getting a level of care that they weren't finding at home or in other communities. So how can we develop this or integrate the theory of caring within educational systems to show to educators, we must first care for these kids before we teach these kids.
Exactly. And that caring is an act of leadership. You might look at some of the work Nell Noddings has done on her ethics of caring, but also Jackie Stefkovich, The Rights of the Child. It's really interesting work that talks about how actually kids have fewer rights in school than they do in shopping malls. And it gets at, this kind of perverse construction of our organizational environment, our cultural logics, that devalues caring for children as an activity that teachers do, and puts it out of the spotlight as a kind of leadership activity, an advocacy for the child. It's a great point.
We have time for another question. Jerry, I have a question while we're waiting. Oh, and there were just some things that popped up in the chat.
Oh, Mark Smiley's got a book. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark was on my dissertation committee. So I've been following his work.
Jerry, since Dr. Gottlieb has just pointed that out, we were just in a meeting where we were talking about instructional coaching, which has become a sort of a focus area for a lot of school districts. And I think the work that I'm specifically thinking about is very US focused. I'm sure there's some stuff like that that goes on in a more international context. But is that just another example of sort of the floating signifier having a different label attached to it? Or is this is coaching and instructional coaching in particular something that goes beyond just a signifier or a way to sort of look at teachers as a target population?
Well, I think there, you'd have to dig into what are the policies actually saying, just like when you look at teacher leadership. So yeah, instructional coaching is very hot now. We've got a here in Pennsylvania, we've got an endorsement, something you can add onto your license to be recognized as an instructional coach. Okay, great. Do you get more money for it? What do you have to do? And in the end, as Hugo pointed out, is it simply a kind of way up the career ladder, or does it really make a difference? And does it actually help people do the work that they need to do? Part of that is probably you can find in the policy documents by seeing whether they've adopted any standard approach to instructional coaching, whether they've got any accountability systems built in. Without any of that, then yeah, it's likely just, a nice term that fits the exigencies of the moment and doesn't really solve the problem. To be frank and kind of pessimistic, because I've been in this business 30 years, and policy gets made the way it gets made.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, we are at the end of our time, and I really thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and all of this information about teacher leadership. I'm a paper guy. I have multiple pages of notes here, so if anybody needs a backup on your notes, I've got you covered. Just so everyone knows, a recording of this presentation will be on our ExpandED website in a day or two. It takes some time to process, and then we'll have that there. Thank you again, Jerry. Thank you so much for spending the time with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.